Wow, this has been good. I've learned a lot from each speaker and admired arguments and rhetoric. Have you had enough? Should I just go away? I mean, I'd be tempted, but alas, I have another angle still. I really would defer if I thought my angle had been covered, but I'm afraid I don't. And I already had plenty to say without notes on the other talks to which I might respond. But let me just start with this question to my friend Fred. I thought he was saying that it was embrace our weirdness. That was what we should do. But then he seemed to be saying we've got to go mainstream or we will die. I understand the draw of both arguments. And I guess one way of characterizing my argument, I mean, our circumstances are difficult. We are facing trends that are at best problematic, that worry me. I don't know what the future is. I don't have a surefire plan or program. But I have this suggestion. We must do both, embrace our weirdness and attend to the mainstream. And what this really means is we must play a role, which includes making friends to help us play a role in the fashioning of the mainstream, because it's always being refashioned. There are choices involved that will yet be made, and there will be a mainstream, despite the flourishing, the blooming of 1,000 flowers of spiritualism. There will be a mainstream, because there will be laws and policies that are authoritative and that shape who we are. I'm not, by the way, I hate to correct an introduction, I'm not sure I wouldn't be better off in the philosophy department at BYU, but I'm not. I think there are twice as many political scientists as philosophers at BYU, roughly. If we got them together to vote, that would be a way of getting me in the philosophy department, I think, at BYU, on both political and scientific grounds, I think. Yeah, well, that's one way of looking at it. Now, I could be subtle and indirect, but time is short, and I'm who I am anyway. But no, time is short, and so I'm going to ask you to cut me some slack, and I'm going to put some propositions on the table that I know could use some nuancing, some defending, some historical contextualization. But time is short. I've got an angle. I want to put it out there, and I want you to trust me that there could be depth beneath some of the tips of these icebergs that I'm going to be pointing up here. I can't contribute to the therapy group of LDS liberal Democrats, alas. I need another therapy group, the therapy group of those who are always excluded from therapy groups of Mormon liberal Democrats. The first 217 lunch invitations I received after taking a position at BYU about 23 years ago were from people who wanted to whisper to me that, look, it's tough being a liberal Democrat at BYU. I think I'm the only one. That was the first 217 people who invited me to lunch. So other people need therapy too, is all I'm saying here. Elder Porter got us off to an interesting start with his talk. I admire Elder Porter. I thought his straightforwardness was bracing and welcome. Let me develop or make a problem of a couple of points that he was making. He dwelt first on the expansiveness, the inclusiveness of the LDS vision, and the way that it seems to invite the kind of project that Randall and Brian and our friends are so admirably pursuing of interfaith diplomacy, which is a shorthand for something richer that Randy expressed very well when he talked. That was one side of Elder Porter's talk. But then he rang what I assume was for many here a sour note. Even for me, I bet it was it's a pity to have to bring this up, but I'm going to keep bringing it up and follow in this train because I think it is important. And that is, along with the expansiveness, is there not this problem with, the terms sound like cliches, but I don't think they're meaningless, with must we not confront as religious people a soulless secularism, a kind of moral decay? That's the problem that I want to address further. It relates to the question that many of you have raised very pertinently. Are secularism and atheism suitable partners for this kind of diplomacy that our sponsors are recommending? And I'm going to argue not exactly, or with caution, or it depends upon what you mean. Now, begin with, let me set up the way I see the problem. And I was going to try to draw this on the board, but I think time is too short, and you probably couldn't read my writing if I wrote fast anyway. So imagine a diagram. I guess we can array this left and right in familiar ways. It'll make it simpler. What we're looking for is openness of conversation on the deepest questions of truth and spirituality. There are two main ways in which that openness can fail to happen. One way, let's say we should put this on your right, shouldn't we? So one way is that we can take the truth to be a given and we possess it, and so what is there to talk about? Okay, that's one way of being closed. But there's another way. Conveniently, we'll put this at the left of the diagram that I'm not drawing. And that would be the viewpoint that there is no truth with a capital T, so what is there to talk about? And you can have your own truth, and you can have your own truth. That, I suggest to you, and it hovers just over the new spirituality that has been discussed here, that relativistic position is also inimical to the kind of conversation that we have been invited to engage in. Let me say I've described it as this left end as relativistic. Let me say something else about it because this will be important. Of course, it's not without content. Its content is precisely the celebration of unlimited personal freedom on the one hand, but this has gone together, at least before the late liberationist style of spirituality, this has gone together with an idea of the authority of science. And these two things have fit together. This is, in a way, central to modern liberal rationalism, that these will be our twin lodestars. We believe together in the foundational truth of science, and this science will be will facilitate our pursuit for limitless personal freedom, the freedom of every individual to do whatever he or she wants. So this left pole is not without content. It doesn't deny knowledge or orientation. It denies, what it denies is that reason has anything to say about the good of the soul, about our ultimate purposes. So now that we've got that bipolarity on our unwritten board, I want to triangulate, because the alternative has to be something that is neither one of those things. Couldn't we describe it starting with a simple proposition that we know something but we don't know everything? Isn't that where Randy must have us starting? Isn't that the precondition of any interesting conversation about anything important? We must know something, and something about the soul, about the whole, about the spirit, about what it all means. And yet we must not know everything, or else, then again, there wouldn't be anything to talk about. As in the quotation from Joseph Smith, our words are broken, imperfect, and messed up. I can't remember the rest of the lovely quotation. But they're not pointless. They still stand for something, however inchoately, that is present in our minds and in our souls. All right. Now I'm going to go Harvey Cox's way and say this all has to be triangulated with attention to the political dimension of our reality, which is not just a dimension hanging out there that we may or may not want to attend to. Whether we attend to it or not, or especially if we don't attend to it, it's there, and it's affecting who we are, the kind of community we are, and the kind of conversations we might have within that community. It turns out that neither life on the individual level nor political society more generally is equivalent to a debating society or an open-ended discussion. What we're doing here, for example, is lots of fun and also genuinely meaningful to me spiritually, but it's not a model, a suitable model for the political dimension of our existence, in which authority necessarily plays a role. And both as individuals and as communities, we must live by what we know practically, as if certain things were settled, even as we strive to bracket these certain things and seek greater light and knowledge. Moreover, as I could quote Tocqueville on this, but I'll forbear, the deepest assumptions we live by as individuals, very beginning of Volume 2 of Democracy in America, if you're curious, the very assumptions we live by as individuals cannot be unrelated to the deepest assumptions of our political community. Let's say that the latter, the authoritative community in which we live, the ancients said the regime, that sounds pretty harsh now, the politeia, let's say that the latter, the political community, provides the default settings, and every society has default settings. No society is simply and purely pluralist. Our so-called pluralism is in fact more and more a secularism, and yes, even, to quote the famous Glenn Beck, since he's put this word newly in circulation, a secular progressivism. So how does this affect our quest for respectful contestation? That's Randy's lovely term, respectful contestation. It would be nice to set politics aside and enjoy our rich conversation among trusted friends in which we are open to infinitely diverse possibilities while grounded practically in real convictions. But to dismiss the political is to fall under its sway. The rich and difficult pluralism, if you wish, the non-generalizable openness of friends to the possibilities, to the possibility that the convictions of one friend may offer enrichments to my convictions. That rich and difficult pluralism, which is an object of aspiration and nothing to take for granted, this true, difficult, and rare pluralism is always at risk. Even here, I propose, among friends, at risk of a confusion with a sham pluralism that is in fact a closed secularism. I think it was Christine who's just said that meaning, we tend to let meaning be defined by authority. Well, it will. The public meaning will be defined by authority. We'll always be wrestling with authoritative meanings, whether we recognize it or not, in the political as well as in the religious realm. For example, when we uncover diversity and apparent contradiction within our own beliefs or within the history of these beliefs, when we discover these problems in the making of our own doctrinal or theological sausage, as has been said, then we may indeed make this out as good news, food for thought to be celebrated, a welcome challenge to think more carefully and deeply about, as was said in this context, things that unite us. But there's always the risk that this good news will come too easy, and that instead of digging deeper and with the help of deeply committed friends, we will join in the ongoing manufacture of mass-marketed sausage. That is, we will simply assume that what unites us is what secular liberalism says unites us. That is, our progressive quest for limitless personal freedom, freedom from authoritative norms, from shared understandings of something higher, some good of the soul, a quest for limitless freedom that is always accompanied with the promise that the scientific mastery of the natural limitations in our humanity will facilitate the progressive overcoming of any of any limits. The risk then is that we will assume a progressive direction to history with a capital H, which would replace truth with a capital H. That's what progressivism with a capital P means. That we know what kind of sausage we are making, and that all that's left is to try to help the less enlightened and progressive ones around us, taking them to lunch, for example, help them to see that there's no authority but the joint reign of science and freedom. This is the factor that we must be aware of when we include non-religious views in our quest for respectful contestation. We must be aware that a certain viewpoint that seems readily, easily, immediately amenable to inclusion in such a rich conversation among friends, that is secular progressive liberalism, the view that all views are equal by default because none can be settled by science, and so all are equally groundless, so none really matters. This view is actually the most crippling to our efforts to be both grounded and open at the same time. For in truth, it is neither grounded nor open. Secular liberal fundamentalism is the most subtle, most alluring, but also most hardened and often self-deceived, non-negotiable, debilitating fundamentalism. I propose to you that Randy Paul would have more to talk about. I think all the three people I'm going to mention now are dead, but yeah, we can hypothesize that. He would have more to talk about with Jerry Falwell than with John Rawls or with Richard Rorty. So by all means, let us examine secular views. That's what I get paid to do, strange as it may seem, at least for now. Prove all things, but do not take openness at face value. Examine secular liberalism well. I think the best way to examine it is the historical genealogical method. See where it came from. Examine the foundational arguments in John Stuart Mill. Go back behind him to John Locke and behind him to Thomas Hobbes and René Descartes. And maybe if you keep going back, you'll see that in a certain way a Machiavellian premise underlies this whole tradition, and that is that the truth is what works. The truth is the joint reign of science and liberation from moral authority. This is not your mother's or William James pragmatism, as you notice. In fact, one of the persons who asked the question about engaging non-religious viewpoints pointed to the atheism of Marx and Nietzsche, and I'm going to say, yeah, in a way those are more suitable partners, because the posture of this neutral openness is not there to beguile us and mislead us. They're not, the danger, however, that when we take up Marx and Nietzsche, just for example, I'll throw in Heidegger into the mix, we're taking up versions that are already pre-liberalized, just sort of reduced to a neutral background of opinions where the democratization of Nietzsche, I think, is the clearest case of this. We get the will to power reduced to the last man's self-expression. Okay, but now I'm talking like a professor to a class who's already read these texts through with me. So this is why intra-faith debate will always be, in a way, primary, intra-faith. This is why it is hazardous immediately to take the side of the openness of the intellectuals against the perceived closure of the regular folks in our Sunday school classes, which is such a common voice that we take in these more academic and intellectual settings. I would propose to you that our academic voices must always, in a way, be derivative of the voices we share with those in whom we have a certain faith in some ultimate realities. This is why that I think Mr. Cannon was right to say that we really haven't gotten beyond the question of whether in the beginning there was God or there was not. This has to remain fundamental. I might paraphrase it in this way, revise the question in this way. Is there authority above human making and therefore above the joint reign of science and freedom, or is there not? And this question always has a political dimension. It must have. I would need to say more to adapt my remarks to the very important theme of late modern or postmodern spirituality. I can condense my argument by saying I think it's late modern. It's never quite postmodern, because the tendency of this spirituality, I don't see it as the good news that it seems to be to many, because I think it's very vulnerable to a co-optation by secularism. Spiritualism is a form of late liberalism or liberationism, where the self-expression tends to eclipse an interest in some authoritative truth. People claiming their own authority. It's true because it's my truth. I'm just echoing language from my predecessors on the panel. This then is why I believe that openness to more light and knowledge must always be supported by firmness in the right, falling into Lincoln's language, firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. As long as liberalism remains our default dogma, and I think it does even under the coming influence of pluralistic spirituality, as long as liberalism remains our default dogma, then we must combine openness to diverse possibilities with courage to fight soulless ideology and moral decay. I suppose that's enough. Thanks.